Buenas tardes. Muchísimas gracias por llenar este lugar empezando el año. Muchísimas gracias a la Fundación Telefónica, donde repetimos en la editorial en otra ocasión especial, otra vez empezando un año. Yo me llamo Marcel, soy editor de Temas de Hoy. El sello que publica este libro, El Viento, Idiota, de Peter Kaldheim. Hoy realmente estamos muy emocionados todos en el sello porque el libro de Peter Kaldheim, que está aquí en el medio, nos parece que es un canto honesto a la idea de que a veces no hay forma de recuperar ciertas vidas que perdemos y lo importante es asumirlo y tener un poco el coraje para emprender otras versiones de nuestra propia vida. La historia de alguien que lo pierde todo, que no lo vuelve a recuperar, pero que encuentra otro nuevo todo. Unas memorias que nos cautivaron mucho en la editorial hace ya un año cuando las leímos. Y siempre tuvimos claro que queríamos empezar este año publicando a Peter, quien tiene la particularidad, además, lo hablábamos ahora hace un rato, de estar hoy con un debut literario a sus 71 años que va a cumplir. Este es su primer libro. En Temas de Hoy nos interesan mucho los debutantes y nos interesa aún más que eso no tenga que ver con la edad, porque a veces
We're really interested in debutantes, and it has nothing to do with age. Sometimes we hate age. And he represents some values that we are very proud to share with all of you today. We are especially grateful to Alberto. I think he doesn't need an introduction. I'm sure most of you here today are all aware of who he is. And it's wonderful, the fact that it's Alberto, the one who's welcoming Peter on his first visit to Spain. So thank you so much, Alberto. I don't know if you're maybe sick and tired of being associated to the idea that you have survived, but two people are sitting here today and they have found different ways to survive, and this is very powerful in a literary sense. And last but not least, Lara Hermoso is with us today as well. A journalist who we very much admire. She's a great reader. She's a well-known voice on radio, and she collaborates with media such as the Rolling Stones, Cadena Ser, and we're honored to have her inaugurating our first event of the year. This is going to be a conversation about a book that probably none of you have read yet, and I hope you come out of this event looking forward to reading it and to getting it and to experience some of these stories that we're going to share here today. So I'll leave you with Lara, with Peter, with Alberto. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Fundación Telefónica. And if we have some time at the end, we might set up a Q&A. We will also do a book signing at the end of the talk. Thank you, Marcel, for such a generous presentation. And thank you, Alberto and Peter, for being here today, presenting this book. Marcel has already been talking about this book. They're very sincere memoirs. It's a very tender book because it's the story of a man who reinvented himself after having traveled to hell. But I would like to go to the beginning of the book. At the beginning of the book, you speak of the previous events that took you from being a consumer of cocaine to turning into a dealer. And something really caught my attention in the book, and that's the fact that you never recreate in the physical feelings of the drugs. You don't go into those details. Why is that?
Really want to glorify the drug. There's so many people that have written about drugs, and it's almost like addiction porn. You know, they think it'll sell a lot more copies if they exaggerate how miserable it makes you feel or how your body reacts to doing drugs. And that wasn't the intention of my story. It's the way it starts out, but it's not where I was going, you know. There are problems. I'm sure Alberto can speak to this too, but the one thing about cocaine is that it's easier to give up than heroin, and I thank stars that I didn't have to deal with that, because I didn't think I would be strong enough to go out on. I got away from cocaine by leaving New York and hitchhiking across America with no money in my pocket, and it was freezing cold. I don't know. I wouldn't have had the physical strength to do it if I was getting clean from heroin. Cocaine was easier to leave behind. It clears out of your system more quickly, I think. And also, I happened to leave New York when it was the middle of winter, and I spent many days on the side of the road waiting for rides where I was so frozen that my body wouldn't have known it was going through withdrawal anyway. So, you know. But I see no reason to glorify that part of it. It was more, my intention in the book was to show that if you believe in yourself and you follow your instinct, which is to go toward whatever, to go toward what works for you, okay? And I didn't, my time on the road was more a matter of learning to have empathy for those around me, where you become so selfish when you're a drug addict that you get sick of your own self. And then I get out on the road and I find people who are in no money situations like me, down and out, but they're willing to share. If they've got a bag of popcorn and that's all they have, they'll give you half of it, because they know no one else understands that situation except those who are in it. And mainly my journey was to get healthy was learning to be empathetic to other people and to be grateful for what was out there.
No sé, Alberto, ¿tú cómo lo ves? O sea, si te ves en...
I don't know, Alberto, how you see this. Do you also recognize yourself, and do you also identify with this idea? In an interview, you once said that drugs changed a lot in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Do you think it was frowned upon more before and it was ever glorified in Spain? Wow. I don't even know where to start with such a broad question. Nothing should be glorified. It's stupid. But I don't deny it either. I know it's there, and it added to my life. I have no remorse, because I didn't hurt anybody. I was an addict in my own way. But of course, drugs do bring that horrible selfishness with them. Heroin is a drug that can destroy everything. It can destroy love and time. Addiction can destroy everything, and that's why it's an addiction. You both say, when you talk about selfishness, Peter says that you never end up thinking about collateral damage until it becomes a fact. And Alberto says that he doesn't feel any remorse. But do you, Peter?
I felt remorse, and it was one of the reasons it took me 30 years to get around to writing this book. I tried to write it when I was in my 50s, and I was still so embarrassed by the behavior that I engaged in when I was in my 20s and 30s. I just didn't feel comfortable facing the person that I used to be. And it took me almost another 20 years to get the distance to where I could say, okay, I did this, and I hurt some people that were close to me. Most of the hurt that you do to people is by withdrawing from them. You cut people out of your life that should be in your life, your family, your close friends. And in that sense, I have more remorse than Alberto. Yeah, but you know, I read something recently by the English novelist Rachel Cusk, and she was talking about evil. And she said she came to the conclusion that evil is an abdication of free will, and desire takes over rather than rationality, and so addiction is in its way, in a certain way, a passion, and you know, even like love, when you're in passion, you cannot seem to find a way out of it until things really go so terribly wrong that there's nothing else you can do.
Bueno, no lo he dicho al principio y me van a reñir los compañeros de la Fundación.
Well, I didn't say this at the beginning, and I'm going to get told off by the Telefónica friends, but you can ask questions through Twitter. So even if you're here, you can also use Twitter to ask any questions that you like. Going back to the beginning of the book, when you left New York in 1987, it's interesting because in 1986, Alberto, you also experienced a breakthrough moment in your life, or a breakup moment. I think you had an important sentimental breakup. You lost your house. How did you face that time in your life? Because Peter started from scratch, and to start a trip where Peter doesn't seem to have a final destination. It looks like it's a trip to nowhere, really, because the offers that you started off with gradually disappear. Who would like to start with their answer? Well, the desire to be born again, the fight to continue. I've been through many tough moments, but there's always something inside me that saves me. Inside yourself? Well, I don't feel like I've got strong willpower, but apparently I must have had it. For example, I never went to a rehab clinic. My wife did. I did it to myself. I withdrew, and I used to use that phrase, I'm withdrawing. I would have a relapse, and then I'd try to get clean again. There's a reason why I was saying before that I've got no remorse. When you do drugs, you go down a lot of steps. What you see, what happens. It's a trip to the heart of darkness. And it doesn't leave anything untouched. But still, I've seen a lot of steps in life, and that was a reason for many of the things I did. I was always lucky enough to have a job at the end of the day, something that could keep me going, especially a job that would allow me the freedom to be able to enjoy drugs. So have you ever been to a rehab center like Alberto?
Alberto, I did it on my own. And when I started getting involved in drugs, it was really glamorous in New York, in the downtown scene, and that was when the famous novel Bright Lights, Big City by Jay McInerney, was kind enough to give me a blurb for the front of the book. I knew him from some of the bars that we frequented together, and he had friends of mine, so I got to meet him. And it was at a time in my life where I was really depressed. Is one of the reasons I got into drugs, because I thought when I got out of college that I would publish my first novel by the time I was 25, and that age came and went, and depression caused me to drink more, and I would hang out in bars in Greenwich Village where published writers hung out, and I got to know a lot of famous writers and was treated as a friend by them. But hanging out with literary writers wasn't the same as being a writer yourself. What I failed to realize back then was that these people I was drinking with at night had already done their writing for the day and were relaxing, whereas I was working in publishing, improving other people's books, but not working on my own. And then I'd get off work and go and get drunk with other writers, and by the time I would get home, I was too tired or too wasted to do the work that I should have been doing to write a novel. So when Jay McInerney hit it big with that story, there was a lot of envy involved, because I said, "Oh, I've been through all the same things he's been, but how come he got it down on paper and I didn't?" It took me a while to realize that you have to have more discipline for any creative endeavor. I'm sure Alberto has the same thing with his photography. It's like, if you don't keep working at it, it stagnates, and you find yourself disgusted with it, and you're afraid to face the effort that's required to communicate to others, whether it's in photography or in words. But it was so glamorous in Tribeca in the 80s that you were almost a social outcast if you weren't doing cocaine in the bathrooms of all the bars at night. Which, unfortunately for me, when I lost all credibility with legitimate employers by not showing up for work after they'd hire me or whatever, and it got to the point where the only way I could make any money to support myself was by selling drugs in these same bars where I'd been doing them before. That was when the only thing you can do to survive is to sell drugs, you're wasting your potential. Jay McInerney wasn't standing in the bathrooms passing packets of cocaine to someone and taking sweaty $20 bills out of their addict hands in order to pay for it. So by the time I got sick of it in '86, I knew I had to. Well, I had run up a big debt to a mafia connected supplier who fronted me these days it sounds like nothing, but back then it was $1,000 worth of cocaine that I was supposed to sell over a Super Bowl weekend in January of 1987. And by that time my habit was so bad that I put half of it up my own nose, and then you're in such a good mood from doing drugs that I gave a lot of it away to friends. And by the time the 3-day weekend was over, I was looking at owing $1,000 to a guy who thought nothing of using a baseball bat to break people's legs, because I'd seen it firsthand. When he was even younger, we were playing basketball together in Greenwich Village at a city gymnasium. And a kid from uptown came down to the West Village, and the kid happened to be from Puerto Rico. And the Italians in the West Village didn't like anyone who wasn't from the neighborhood playing in that gym. And this guy came and he did a little trash talking to Bobby. And next thing you know, he whistled, and and all of his friends came out with baseball bats, and Bobby led them off, and they broke the guy's leg so bad that his shin bones were sticking out in 3 places, and so I don't know. It just shows how crazy you can be on drugs. If that a few years after I'd seen him do that, I ended up doing business with the guy on credit. I must have had a death wish. So once when I owed that much money at the end of the weekend, I said, no, there's no way I can stay away from him in New York. I just have to leave town. And that was my saving grace, that I left out of fear, but I ended up finding myself out on the road. And luckily I had read Jack Kerouac when I was a teenager, and his book On the Road was such a great inspiration to me. I said, well, if I'm going to do this, I may as well take notes while I'm going and see if I can't turn it into something like Jack Kerouac did. And it was just the action of taking notes while I was out on the road and meeting different people. It allowed me to have a small amount of self-esteem, even though I was a complete loser in most other ways of life. But I said, well, if I can believe in myself, then someone will believe in me eventually, or I hope, So that was what saved me. And I'm sure if you didn't have photography, you might not be here either, right?
Peter ha hecho un buen resumen del inicio del libro. Tal vez tendríamos que...
Peter's made a good summary of the beginning of the book. He has a degree in English literature. He works in the publishing agency world in New York. He used to do that, so he really had to succeed in life. He wanted to publish a novel before being 25, and all these facts led to, well, before you left New York, there's another episode. There's a time you spent in prison.
Perdón.
Yeah, sorry. And in the book it seems that it's difficult for you to face that memory when you were in prison, right?
In retrospect, to think about being in prison, nobody likes to think about being in prison. And I was in one of the worst ones in New York. I don't know, people here may not know of Rikers Island, but it's a pretty nasty prison, and mainly because of overcrowding. And I happened to go there in the 80s when the crack cocaine epidemic was really taking off. Thank goodness I never got into the smoking and the crack, but it ended up putting so many people into the jails that, you'd be in a cell that was supposed to be for 40 people, and they'd have 100 in there, and 2 guards to watch over it. When people I don't care how nice the prison might be, when you put too many people jammed up against each other, nothing good can happen. But what saved me in there would just happen to be that because I knew the Italians, there was a Italian from another family who was locked up in the same cell as me. So the people that I was buying from sent word that I was an okay guy. So there was blacks, Puerto Ricans, and there were a lot of Vietnamese gangs in there too. But in this 100-bed unit, the Italians had their one little corner, and they made a bunk for me there. So I got off easy. I didn't get hassled as much as as I would have been if I didn't have someone as a godfather, as they say. I guess there's some advantage to dealing with organized crime, but that time in Rikers Island, I try not to think of it. To this day, I can't watch a movie that's set in a prison. I said, oh, been there, done that. I don't want to see it. I don't care. I don't care if it's David Simon or any great writer. I don't know about you. You probably don't want to see films about rehab or something. Well, you weren't in rehab, but...
¿A ti te gusta verlo?
¿El qué?
Do you like to watch these movies about rehab, or do you reject them? I'm interested on the work, on the piece of art, so to speak. If it's a good piece of art, if it's a good work and it really amuses me, well, I haven't been in prison, I understand him. I really understand that he doesn't want to watch it. And about rehab, well, movies do not deal with that, generally speaking. Well, Peter, and with all that background, with all the stories, problems with organized crime after being in prison, when you had lost your second wife, it's when you go into the road, and it's funny because you follow Kerouac's steps, who's a writer that had some problems with illegal substances, right?
Yeah, he was into benzodrine was the drug of choice for he and Jack and Neil Cassidy, and also they smoked reefer. They called it reefer back then, marijuana. But his main problem was drinking. He drank himself to death, unfortunately, and no one could get him to stop. But by that time, he had stopped writing. He was living in Florida. He got an esophageal hemorrhage from drinking too much. I went to visit his grave after I had the advanced galleys of the book in English, and when I saw the galleys, I thought I would never have this book happening if it weren't for Jack Kerouac. I owed him so much, and I had never been to his visit his grave, so I got on a train from New York, where I live, and Jack Kerouac's buried in Massachusetts, in the town where he was born, Lowell, Massachusetts. So I had to take a long train journey up to Boston, and then switch to local trains to go. And I got to his grave. It was an April day, and it was raw and windy and cold as anything, and there was no one else in the graveyard. But I went there, and I tore up. There's a ceremonial urn in front of his grave marker that people that love his work, they when they visit the grave, they put little tokens into the urn, things that he would have liked, like cigarettes or pens and little small pint bottles of liquor and things like that. So when I saw all that stuff, and flowers, of course, I tore out the title page from the advanced galleys of my memoir, and I folded it up small and put it in there, and felt like I'd paid my respects. And I happened to. It was funny because I went the day after the Boston Marathon is run, and I got up to the main station in Boston, and I'm suffering from arthritis these days, so I limp a lot. But I got off the train in Boston to get a local train to Lowell, and I look around the concourse, and there's all these people that are 30 years younger than me just limping as bad as I am, and I couldn't understand why these people were all limping until I found out it was the day after the marathon, and these were all the people who had been running 26 miles. So, but the funny thing was that by the time I went up there and came back on the same day, so it was almost 22 hours of travel that I was on the train. And when I got back to my house, there was a big package sitting on my front porch. And it had a London shipping address, and I knew exactly what it was. It was the final copies. I had 20. They sent me 20 copies of the book. So here I visited Jack. I come home, and there it is. And the funny thing about also about that cemetery is so many people go to visit Jack Kerouac's grave that if you go into the little cemetery office where they have the people that tell you where to find the grave, I no sooner walked in the door than the girl behind the counter goes, "Hi, are you here for Jack?" So it tickled me to think that so many fans of Jack Kerouac would show up there, that her default first greeting is, "Are you here for Jack?" And when I got home and found all the books waiting on my porch, I said, "Yep, and Jack's here for me too." It was a good experience.
No sé, Alberto, si tú también eres.
I don't know, Alberto, if you're a great Kerouac's fan, if you are closer to Robert Frank's work, or... Well, when I was in my 20s, we knew the American counterculture, and I read Kerouac and all the writers by that time, and we had a great influence by comics, by the American comics. The top comic with Spin Rodriguez. Well, all important writers by then. One of the questions that we've got through Twitter, you know that you can ask them with hashtag El Viento, Idiota. They asked Peter why it was so long for him to write the book. There's something funny. It took 30 years for Peter to write this book, but Alberto, you take many pictures, or some pictures of people on heroin, of yourself doing heroin. I mean, your addiction becomes into life art, so to speak. No. I didn't see it that way. In my case, and in all my people were started when we were in our 20s, and without thinking of what that was. We had the influence of Barrows, the counterculture, American counterculture, well, that glamour that Peter has mentioned before. I didn't perceive it as something evil. Well, photography, well, I was starting to take pictures, and I was looking at my surroundings and in what I knew, so to speak. And when I looked through the camera, although it was drug, I tried to compose, I tried to focus, I tried to magnify, I tried to... I mean, this is what photography does sometimes. I was taking pictures, drug pictures for some time. I had to break them sometime later, because if a police raid, yes, because, well, photography is like if it could report on me, so to speak. Do you regret on that? We always regret on doing these type of things, of course, but well, it's funny because I've read some of your interviews, Alberto, and you said that you had taken half of the pictures that you could have taken. And Peter said something before when he said that he wanted to become a writer. He went to the village to drink with these writers that had some works, but for that they needed discipline. I don't know if you had some problems in terms of discipline in your case, Peter, or self-control. Maybe you got seduced by drugs and that took you out of the right way.
I believe that's partially it, but the reason it really took me that long to write the book was, well, there's several reasons, but the book tells the story of my cross-country journey, and when I went from the East Coast to the West Coast and got clean and was living on the street and trying to get back into normal life, I finally got employment in Yellowstone National Park as a cook's helper in a hotel at Mammoth Hot Springs. And it turned out that the head chef for all the kitchens in the park was from the same neighborhood in Brooklyn that I had grown up. So I got lucky there, and he took me under his wing, and within 2 years I was the head chef at that hotel. So it ended up being another 25 years of my life devoted to culinary pursuits, where I didn't have as much time to write because I was working 60-hour shifts like chefs usually do. And when I was writing, I would try to write fiction. And I started and abandoned at least 3 novels during the a 20-year span from 1987 to early 2000s. Even though I had a good friend in the publishing business in New York who kept encouraging me to write a memoir about my time on the road, because I had sent him some long letters from the transient hotel that I ended up in Portland, Oregon. And he was so moved by the letters back in 1987 that he proposed that I expand my story into a book-length memoir. And I was stubborn. I had a notion that I didn't want to have my first book be a memoir. I wanted to have a novel. Well, time went by and I kept on, you know what John Lennon says, life is what happens while you're busy making other plans. And so I stayed with the culinary stuff and I kept trying to write fiction, but I didn't have the serenity I think that it takes to actually throw myself into it, because when you're in the chef business, your work goes home with you. You're worrying about what the menu is for the next week or where you're going to get the staff that you need and all those things. And it wasn't until 2002 that I decided I'd take my friend Jerry's advice and try to write the memoir. Because I had just, my wife had divorced me and moved back to Yellowstone Park, and I was working at Montana State University as a head chef there. So I was left living in a mobile home that happened to be right next to the mobile home where Richard Brodigan, I don't know if any of you remember him from the 60s, but he lived there for a time and he was a favorite of mine, so I felt lucky to be living on the same river where he was. But in any case, I ended up with free time, a lot of quiet time in the place when I wasn't married anymore. So I gave it a first try. And because I was working at the university, I had access to the internet, which I'd never had before. So I was able to write a chapter at a time and email it to my friend Jerry, the editor in New York, and get his feedback on it. But after about a year and a half of working on that version of it, I got disgusted because it didn't have the shape I had imagined in my mind. It didn't have the voice that I felt was authentic. And I put it aside, and I didn't pick it up again for another 15 years after I retired from cooking, and I moved back to back to New York, where I had two younger brothers who were in poor health, and as soon as I was old enough to take retirement from the university, I moved back to take care of them in the final 3 years of their lives, and they both died of cancer within 4 days of each other. And after that, I was the last one left in my family, and I was the oldest brother, and I had no brothers left, and my parents had passed. So I had no one to share my grief with except my good friend Jerry, the editor in New York. And he and his wife invited me up for a long lunch a couple months after my brothers died, and I unburdened all my grief on them and had a good cry with them. And as the lunch was ending, my friend Jerry, who started with this idea in 1987 and just wouldn't let it go, he said, "You know, Peter, maybe now is the time to give your memoir a try again, and it'll give you something to take your mind off your grief." And what really opened it up for me was, I said, well, I had trouble writing it. It didn't feel right the first time. And it was because I was trying to write what I thought was a traditional memoir where you start with your young self and you work your way into adulthood. And that wasn't working for me. And he said, no, you had this great journey across America. Use the journey as the skeleton of the book. Tell what happened to you on the road between the East Coast and the West Coast, staying in homeless shelters, hopping freight trains, hitchhiking, all the stuff that Kerouac did. And then just fill in here and there with memories of your younger life. And that was the key. That was the key. Once I took that to heart, I threw away the original manuscript I had, and I started from scratch a few weeks later. And all I had to work from was some notebooks that I kept while I was out on the road, and I still had 30 years later. And for some reason, it just started to come. I think part of it, too, was that I finally reached an age where I had enough distance from the embarrassing younger self that I was. I could speak honestly without cringing about divulging things that I'm embarrassed to this day about. But at least I could address the issues honestly, which is my main hope. And as I started to do that, I got a chapter done in 30 days, and I went right into the next chapter. And it turned out every month I wrote a chapter for 10 months, and the book was done. And it was the first time in my life I ever started a manuscript and got all the way to the end. So I was cheering. There was nobody to hear me, but I was cheering anyway, alone in my house. But it was really a great moment. So.
Fíjate, dices que escribiste el libro una vez solo quedaba.
So you say that you wrote the book once you were the only one left from your family. Your parents were dead, your brothers were dead, and you say that you wrote the book because you were able to do it with a certain degree of honesty. There's something in the book that you don't really specify. Your parents break up with you, or you break up with your parents, but you don't really specify what actually went on. Maybe you wouldn't have been able to write that book with such honesty if they had still been alive, and even after them having died, I have a feeling you're still protecting them in what you're writing.
I protected them because I revealed some things about my parents that they certainly wouldn't have liked to be out in public, but they were key parts of my life that influenced me later in life. I think what really freed me was that my younger brothers were gone, because my brothers have this code of honor where you didn't air the family's laundry outside of the house, which is fine if you're in the movie like The Godfather, but if you're trying to write a memoir and honesty is your goal, you can't avoid certain things from your childhood that affected you going forward through the rest of your life. So I talk a little bit about my mother's own problems with alcohol, although she kept a family together. She was just, as a kid, I would notice that I'd go to my friend's house to visit, and their mothers were always dressed at 4 o'clock and doing stuff around the house. Where if you went to my house at 4 o'clock, my mother was still in her bathrobe, and she'd be ironing, but she'd have a can of beer on the end of the ironing board. A detail like that to somebody who ends up being involved with drugs and alcohol, how can you leave it out? It's a formative thing in your life. But if I could never have written that when my brothers were still alive, especially when they were sick, because if I had written this while they were in ill health, I would have felt like I was just sticking a knife in them. So, yeah, there's something. It was definitely liberating to be the last one left in the family. Although, I don't recommend any of you writers out there that you wait till everyone in your family is dead so that you can feel like you have the freedom to say what you like. My father was a strict man, and I talk about some of that in the book, where one time I was, how children always are afraid of a monster under the bed, and they cry out in the night, and the parents have to come and comfort them. Well, my father was a Norwegian, 6'4", 240 pounds, and one night I kept crying out, and my mother was pregnant with her third child at the time, and he didn't want her being disturbed. He came in the bedroom, and the first time, and he picked me up out of bed, with one hand, and with one hand he could lift the whole bed up, and he said, "Look, there's no monster under there." He put the whole bed back down and dropped me in the bed, and he said, "Don't make me come in here again." Well, I heard noises again. We happened to be living in Brooklyn above a grocery store, and it was a mice-infested store, so you'd hear things in the night. I think that's probably what I was hearing. And the second time I cried, he came in and he grabbed me out of bed and he took me into the kitchen and he set me on the Formica table. And I said, "What are you doing, Dad?" He says, "I'm making a sandwich." I said, "What kind of sandwich?" He said, "A Peter sandwich." And then he got out his big carving knife and his steel, and he started sharpening the knife. And he got out a loaf of bread, and he put it on the counter. And then I said, I was thinking, this is a joke. He's not really going to do this. But my father had been in the Navy, and then in the Navy the food was so bad that he got in the habit of putting ketchup on all of his food. And he still did that when he was out of the Navy. So he went in the refrigerator and took out the bottle of ketchup and put that on the table next to me. And I said, "Oh my God, he's going to eat me." And I screamed so loud it woke up my poor pregnant mother, and she came out in the kitchen and sees my father with the carving knife and the big fork that he used for cutting the roast beef on a Sunday dinner. She said, "Gus, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm teaching the kid a lesson." And he was right. He taught me a lesson. I never said anything at night after that.
Esa anécdota la cuenta en el libro, es uno de los motivos por los que tenéis que...
That anecdote is in the book. It's one of the reasons why you absolutely must read it. Among the many anecdotes that are told in that trip from coast to coast, one of my favorite parts is that part where you were in Portland, and that's where you realize that you're definitely a homeless man, and you resort to food checks and to poor people hotels, but you talk about it with no dramatism at all.
I tried to be a kind of documentary in a way that Alberto, I think, recognizes. You know, things can speak for themselves if you just put them in the right light and arrange them. You know, and what you see is what you get. And yeah, in Portland, I had the advantage of, people have compared this book to George Orwell's story about being homeless, called Down and Out in Paris and London. And when I ended up reading that while I was down and out myself in Portland, that I knew about the book, but I had never gotten around to reading it. And I was amazed at how similar the things he was describing in the 1930s in England. I could have picked the characters in his book and put them right on the same street corners that I was hanging out in the Skid Row district of Portland, and it would have been almost no different. The big thing that it was an advantage for me that Orwell didn't have is that you could now sell your plasma for cash. They didn't have plasmapheresis when Orwell was bumming around. So it was actually selling my blood that allowed me to save up enough to get a room in a transient hotel. And as long as you had a room in the hotel that was paid for a week, you could go to this social service agency. Because it was the winter time, they had a subsidy that they would give to people who couldn't afford to pay their own heating bills if you owned a house. But if you didn't own a house, you could still qualify if you went to one of these approved hotels and brought them a receipt for your 1 week's rent that you had paid with your own money. So I brought that in, and they gave me 6 weeks of free rent that they sent directly to the hotel. I never touched it. But that was the amount of time I needed to get through the coldest months of the winter. So I was grateful for that. And once you're indoors off the street, you can start making a lot of better other changes to your life that when you're on the street, it's hard to get anywhere except cold.
Alberto, tú nunca pasaste...
Alberto, you never went through through anything like that, but you did talk about a trip to Venice in 1986 in which you said it was the first time that the lack of resources seemed unbearable to you. How was that? What was that like? Do you understand the crash that Peter felt? I didn't have any resource whatsoever. And I had to sell my photographic equipment. Well, throughout my life I've had to pawn my equipment so that I could buy some drugs. The worst part is how helpless you feel. I've had to sleep in the streets. And I was cold, and it wasn't just the cold, it was this helplessness. In Venice, I had a horribly difficult problem, which was to be able to shit. In Venice, there is so much tourism that if you don't consume in a bar, and they're not precisely cheap, they won't let you use the toilets. And when you're sleeping like that, the feeling of helplessness is terrible. And I promised myself that would never happen again. Did it never happen again? Not in that way. But yes, in a certain different way. Yes. After that, there was a change, though. And I decided not to work. I wanted to live off photography. It's interesting because your addiction problems made you become a photography professional, and it made Peter stray away from them, from his professional path. The paths of the Lord. Isn't it interesting for you, Peter, that he managed to build himself a future, from that starting point?
It's a miracle, really, when you think about it. I know exactly what he's talking about, finding a place to sit. It's the same thing in Portland. And the other problem is you go to you're eating at soup kitchens and they're taking leftover food from restaurants, and it's great to get it, but sometimes it's past its due date and it gives you terrible bowels. And I can remember running from one place to the next down the main street of Portland trying to find somewhere that would let me get in, and nobody would. So the only option was a park that had public bathrooms in the park that anyone could use. And there's no worse feeling than getting within a block of where you want to be and then having everything let go. And then what do? You don't have a house to go to. You don't even have a spare change of underwear. And you find yourself taking off your pants, throwing the underwear away, rinsing your jeans with whatever water you can get from the sink, and still you're happy because you're finally empty. But I also know I know what Alberto's saying about the helplessness you feel. When you're sleeping outdoors, you don't know who's going to come and do something to you. That's why you'll see, even here, I notice on Gran Via, a lot of the homeless people have a dog. And it's the same in the States. They get a dog not because they want companionship. They want an animal that will wake them up if someone's coming to steal their bottle of wine or to hit them over the head and try and take their sleeping bag, whatever. So I feel bad for those poor dogs that have to live that life because they didn't do anything wrong. But there they are.
La memoria selectiva actúa como
Selective memory works as a proxy, and that leads you to self-harm. Has any of you fallen into that vice? So memory is sometimes like a proxy. So you tend to sweeten your past experience in order to face your future? Have you ever fallen in that temptation? Well, I've fallen into the temptation of doing numbers with myself and trying to draw the line. For example, I had to talk about that in the one book I wrote, and I had to remember certain things that were very painful to remember: the death of my brother, many things. I could not have turned it into an apology either. I had to look at it in an honest light. Well, there is something that I can't help. I have those images, and with every image I see, my life comes back to me, and a cascade of memories comes along with it. I can't help feeling that way when I look at my photographs. But I try not to dwell in that. It's a reality that will always be there. Peter, when you took your travel notes 30 years later, did you erase anything that you didn't want to remember? Any chapter that you weren't able to face up to?
I just had more material than I thought was useful. So some things I left out, and because I wanted to show the empathy of the people that I met on the street, I chose to focus on what I call the brotherhood of the road, how people will help each other even when they have nothing. Even though I did encounter some people that were just scoundrels that I didn't want anything to do with. And there were some, I didn't bother to tell about how I stay in a Salvation Army and got infested with lice and had to go to a public bath where they gave out special chemicals that you get all the lice out of you, and meanwhile you're itching. It's an interesting detail, I suppose, but I think most people understand that if you're living in shelters like that, stuff like that will happen. There no sense aggrandizing it. But I do remember we're talking about not feeling safe when you're out on the road. Shortly before I finally got back into normal life by landing a job in Yellowstone Park, I was staying in Seattle, and I had met two Vietnam veterans about my age who were alcoholics, and they were taking the same freight train from Portland north to Seattle with me, and I ended up palling around with them for about another month in Seattle before I finally landed a job by mail, by answering a mail ad for help in Yellowstone Park. But the place where they stayed, it was funny, they said, I'm going to take you to, you can come stay at our trailer park with us. And usually a trailer park you think of, or I guess in Europe they may call them caravans. I thought, oh, how could these guys be alcoholics and have a trailer? It wasn't that. They take me outside of town to an industrial part of town where they rented U-Haul trailers that people would rent to hook up to the back of their vehicle and move their belongings when they had to leave one house to another. So these were all sitting there empty, and they found out that the people that ran the trailer rental place never showed up before 6 a.m. So you'd go, and they were gone by 8 p.m. So we'd go out there at night and sleep in these empty trailers, and make sure to get out of there before the owners came in. We thought we were getting away with it, but apparently these guys were leaving too many empty wine bottles and things around the lot, and I guess the owners got wise to it. And it was right next to an abandoned railroad track that had a storage bin that they used to put railroad equipment in, but it wasn't used anymore. So the guys were storing their sleeping bags there, and that's where I put mine too. So we'd leave it there all day when we were going around the city. and then take them out at night before we went to sleep. Well, these people who ran the rental place, they figured out where the stash of the sleeping bags were, and while we were out one day, they came in, they poured kerosene all over the sleeping bags, and luckily I wasn't drinking. I had stopped drinking, but I went out there with my two friends that night to go to sleep, and we all pulled our sleeping bags out and each got into a trailer, and they were so drunk, and they always smoked before they went to sleep. And luckily I smelled it, and I said, hey guys, they doused our sleeping bags with kerosene or gasoline. Don't light a cigarette. And otherwise they would have both been burnt to a crisp. And that's what people do to get rid of bums. I mean, why couldn't they just, take the sleeping bags and throw them away or cut holes in them? But no, they're going to pour gasoline on it so that someone's likely to end up dead. It just shows you what you have to worry about when you're living out on the street.
Una de las preguntas que nos hacen por Twitter, le da las...
One of the questions that we get asked on Twitter says, thank you for coming, says, there's always something sexy about a writer and his addictions. New generations always find that attractive. What would you say to these young writers that believe that there's always something sexy about?
I would tell them what my mother always said. Do as I say, not as I do. Yeah, I think it's a legitimate question, because it's easy to get, when you're younger and you read these stories by people who have survived drugs. It's one of the reasons that I ended up getting into drinking too much, is because a lot of the writers that I fell in love with as a young man all had problems with alcohol or drugs. I mean, people like Malcolm Lowry with Under the Volcano, and Kerouac himself, and name it, Charles Bukowski, living on Skid Row in L.A. and drinking wine, and getting rolled by whores and everything like that. That's glamorous when you're young and your parents are paying for your rent, and you say, oh, let me get out and do something wild. Well, that's not the wild you want to do. You can, and the truth is, if you observe the world, Alberto will tell you this, you can learn just as much by observing as by doing. If you really want to get out and experience the world, you don't have to take the bad in order to get the good. That's what I think.
No sé si alguien del público quiere hacer alguna.
I don't know if we have any question from the audience. Now it is time. Oh, don't be shy, come on. Well, if nobody wants to ask any question, I will ask another one. Well, this book is called like a Bob Dylan song. Please, tell us why.
Well, I was a big fan of Bob Dylan, still am. And that particular song of his, Idiot Wind, is a song that Lou Reed once said he wished he had written, and I love Lou Reed. So, I mean, that's high praise from Lou Reed, because he didn't believe anybody wrote a better song than him. But in that particular song, there are certain lines that I just felt encapsulated what I was trying to explain about how you can get so that you can do things against your own best interest. Your mind tells you you shouldn't be doing these drugs, and yet something, desire, makes you do it anyway. And that to me was the idiot wind that taking over. There's a line in the song that says, "We're idiots, babe. It's a wonder we can even feed ourselves." And that's where you end up if you had a life like mine. So when I was writing the memoir, I said, yeah, that should be a pretty good title for it, and I'm glad. And it translates nicely into Spanish too. Idiota has some force in Spanish, I think.
Tiene mucha fuerza.
It has power. Well, the idiot wind has blown sometimes in your life because years after going out of drugs, you had a problem, or you became into a gambler. So when you've been a gambler, and when you've been an addict, are you afraid of that idiot wind to hit your life again?
No, I think I finally outgrew it. It took me 7 decades, but no, I haven't had any kind of addiction problems in the last 20 years. I'll knock on some plastic wood here, but no, you know, one of the things, you cannot write an honest memoir like this unless you reach the stage where you know yourself enough to be honest. And I think I knew myself enough to know that I'm not facing that kind of problem anymore. And depression, you know, depression was a lot of the reason that drove me into the various addictions that I had. But there's nothing left for me to be depressed about. I've published a book. I'm good on this earth. You know, whatever happens tomorrow, that's it. I left something behind. So if any of you want part of it, you can have it.
Ese viaje que tú haces de costa a costa.
Well, this journey from coast to coast in the US, there's an important role. You highlight how good people were in the road. Can you reinvent another life? I mean, you speak about selfishness of the addict. Is it possible to reinvent yourself without the good things of the others? Alberto says no. I don't think so. It's impossible.
Say they reinvent themselves. No, you just find something that was in you. If it wasn't in there, you're not going to find it, you know? The problem is clearing away all of the garbage that was covering up what that's not, I don't consider that reinventing. I think that's just, you know, coming back to yourself, finding your way back to whatever true person you are inside, you know.
Alberto, ¿tú crees que te has reinventado?
Albert, do you think that you've reinvented yourself, that you've lived many lives, or that this life is a consequence of what you've lived? I think that I've lived some lives, but I'm still afraid of that idiot wind. I know that it's always blowing. It can blow because either well, in 1,000 times, for example, I can't smoke, and sometimes I play hide and seek to smoke. Well, the idiot wind is always there in your ear. You fight against yourself, and to me, well, I will always be fighting against myself. So one has overcome it, and the other hasn't. I mean, one's not listening to it anymore, and the other's still listening to it.
I'd like to add to that there was a line I wanted to use as the epigraph to the book, but it was from the Grateful Dead, and I would have had to pay too much money under the English laws of fair use. But I think you should keep this in mind, Alberto, if you're worried about the idiot wind. There's a song by the Grateful Dead called American Blues, and there's a line in it that said, "Give me 5, I'm still alive. Ain't no luck, I learned to duck." Just duck under that idiot wind, let it blow somebody else over. Don't you get hit anymore.
Peter, cuando tú estás en Portland y donas plasma.
Peter, when you're in Portland, when you sold your plasma to get some money, one of the first things when you got documentation is to get the ID card from the library. And you were able to have books to read, and on the book there are constant references to songs, to music. I don't know if art, even at your darkest times, has been some kind of shelter, some kind of, to connect with that life that you had lost.
Well, I'm not sure I understood the question. When? I didn't quite hear that. When I was in Portland and I owe the library card, yes. Well, my whole life libraries are. My mother was a great reader. That was the greatest gift she ever gave me, was teaching me to read before I even started the first year of school. And I'm reminded of one of my favorite writers, Jorge Luis Borges. He had a great line. He said, I've always imagined paradise as a kind of library. I mean, if there is a God, I hope he has a very liberal policy on handing out library cards, because I would like to get in. But yeah, writing is always, it almost became my religion, or reading more than writing. It took me a while to get to the writing, but I mean, I would stand on the line at the soup kitchens, and it would be 100 people long, and I'm waiting my turn to get in, and I always had a book to read from the library, and the other tramps that I knew, they started calling me the professor, and someone would come up and ask me if I could read a letter that somebody sent them that they couldn't read, or or write a letter for them, and I was always happy to do it. Anybody who can understand, who enjoys language should be willing to share it. I just wish I had gotten around to sharing more of it in my lifetime, but what can I say? Here I am.
Tu sueño siempre fue escribir.
Your dream was always to write a novel before being 25. You didn't make it, but you published your memoirs with 70. Will you publish a novel before 75, or that aspiration is over?
When I finished this book and I finally convinced myself that I could start on page 1 and get to the end of something, it was very liberating. So yeah, I'm writing a novel now that I'm hoping will be done sometime later this year, and it's kind of in a magical realism vein. So, and it's set in Montana, where I lived for 25 years. That's as much as I'll give away right now. But I'm enjoying writing it, and I don't have the same fear that I don't know how to finish a book anymore. I know I've got it in me to finish one. If my time on Earth doesn't run out before my my final chapter, I hope to have it finished.
Sigue sin haber ninguna pregunta.
So, do we have any questions from the audience? Okay, we have some brave people here.
We're just old white guys. Survivors.
Esta chica de gris.
Hello, good evening, Mr. Kaldheim. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for coming along. Well, the title of the book, The Idiot Wind, comes from a song by Bob Dylan. It seems like music is very important in the book. I don't like Bob Dylan very much, but the Grateful Dead, well, I'm a great fan. And I would like to know if you play any instrument and if you've ever wanted to be a musician. Thank you.
Yes, I've always wanted to play an instrument, and no, I never learned how to play anything. In school, when I was tried to join the band, I wanted to play French horn, but they started me out on an E-flat horn, which is like if you want to be riding a motorcycle like Alberto, and they give you a moped, So I gave it up, and then when I got to liking the blues, I tried to learn to play the mouth harmonica, and I was just horrible at it. So yeah, so only instrument I play is the radio.
¿Algún valiente más?
Anybody else?
Hola, Peter.
Hello, Peter. I would like to know if you would like your book to be taken to be made into a movie, because it's a true fact story. It's your own life. Would it be interesting to you to make this into a movie? Thank you.
Yes, it certainly would. And in fact, my agent in New York has a few months ago was approached by a Hollywood production company that wanted to represent me to producers and directors, and they're a pretty big. They do. I don't know if they show them over here, but all of those Maze Runner movies, they're kind of sci-fi things, but that's their big money maker. But they've been in business for 25 years. But my agent is a very savvy guy. He never goes for the first offer. So he said, well, if I know this woman who owns the company, and she's the one that wrote to him and said she loved the book and would like to represent it. He said, if she bit that easily, there's somebody else out there. So a few months back, he sent copies of the book to a bunch of other film production companies, and I'm just waiting to see if something comes of it. Nowadays with so much cable TV, you can get things that wouldn't be a movie. Like, I have friends that know me from Yellowstone Park who say that, oh, this would make a good Netflix 6-part series, you know. And I said, whatever, as long as it pays the bills.
Alberto García-Alix, ¿le gustaría?
Alberto García-Alix, would you like to be your life in a movie? No. You've been really overwhelming. Do you like to be taking pictures or not? A movie like about me? No, I don't like that idea at all. So, any further question to me or to Alberto? Hello, Peter. Here. Hello, how are you doing? Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting session. Well, I was having a look at the cover of the book, and there's a quote that it comes from the Times. It says that it's a savvy and warm mix between Jack Kerouac and George Orwell. I think the beatnik part will always appear in every session because this part is really attractive, but the question is, what is the part that has to do with George Orwell in the novel or in the memoir?
It's the memoir doesn't really have much to do with George Orwell. I only read his book near the end of my journey across country. It's more that people who've read the book in advance copies, so many of them compare my stories of what life was like among the down and out, that it brought out echoes of Orwell's classic book. So I'm terribly flattered that people would think that, but I mean, he was not a model for me when I was writing this, although I had become aware of his book and I loved it, but the influence was more Jack Kerouac or the beat writers, and also an American novelist named Frederick Exley, who wrote a marvelous novel called Fan's Notes back in the 60s that I was much moved by. Another poor writer who drank himself to death, but he left behind some beautiful work. I hope that answers your question.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Any further question? Yes, at the back. Thank you, Peter. My question is, well, the fact of publishing the book has made all these 30 years come into some sense because you were looking for yourself in some way, or if you hadn't published this book and it was just some notes, maybe these notes would make sense to you anyway. Thank you.
The notes made sense to me when I took them, but being able to share them is what made the experience really complete for me. I mean, if I had gone to my grave without publishing this story, I would have felt like I left something undone. And thankfully, I had a publisher in London that took a liking to the book, and it took 18 months of being out on the market before I finally found a publisher that wanted it. And then everything happened really fast after that, because as soon as I got signed in England, within 2 months I had deals from Spain, and next month it comes out in French, and there's a Dutch edition that's already available online, and in June there'll be an Italian edition published by the same publishing house that publishes Elena Ferrante. So I know they have enough money to fly me to Italy if they choose. I hope they're watching this Twitter feed.
Sí, el Peter de hace 30 años.
So 30 years ago, somebody had told Peter this, the fact that he was going to write a book, they would publish it in the UK, he would lose Elena Ferrante's steps. Would you have believed that?
That's how I can say it in polite company.
Bueno, pues con esta declaración de...
So, with the statement, we wrap up the session. If you want to have a signed book, please don't join us to the stage, because he will sign them at the back. So, do yourself a favor, read the book. It's a nice book, a beautiful book about not reinventing yourself, but about how to build your life after making many mistakes. Thanks, Alberto. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Temazeo, and thanks to Fundación Telefónica. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara.